Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
How are you, Sasha? How's it going?
It's going well. Today was really interesting. We spoke with a comedian. She's a national touring headliner. Her name is Arielle Isaac Norman. And she has a comedy special called Ellen DeGenderless, which is all about gender. And it's actually shocking and subversive, but also hilarious and surprising in ways that I've not heard other comics really notice or point things out that she is pointing out. So it's been an amazing conversation.
Yeah, there's a few comedians who's kind of raised their head over the parapet, like Ricky Gervais, Dave Chappelle, obviously Graham Linehan. There's a few of them. But Ariel comes from she comes from the queer community and she calls it like it is. She's very, very funny, but she still loves the queer community. So she's actually, she doesn't pull her punches. She's a truth teller. She tells it straight. But she's a millennial. She's from this world and she has an inside information that I think people will really benefit from hearing.
Yeah. And along similar lines, I was thinking, as we were talking yesterday, audience members, no matter where they stand on the political spectrum, no matter what their background is, people are going to find moments that they love and they're so excited about. And everyone's also going to be offended at some point. She's like, an equal opportunity offender. And I thought that was really refreshing and interesting because we got to hear, like you said, from a millennial who's really part of this community, who's able to call things out from a really informed place, right? So I think listeners will be really curious to hear her special, Ellen DeGenderless, because you can tell in the jokes and the writing and the punchlines, she knows this world inside and out. Yeah. She knows it very well. She knows everything about youth pediatric medicine. She knows about the non-binary identities, and she's an insider critiquing it.
Ariel was very interesting about Trump, I thought, because she gives some insight into the change that came over her own queer community, and she saw the difference, and she saw it was a reaction to Trump getting in. It wasn't wasn't all these Trump voters that changed. It was the fear that was kind of arose as a result of Trump getting in. I think she has some really, really profound insight into what it's like to be a millennial, queer, gender nonconforming, lesbian, the whole lot. And she does it with humour.
Yeah. So if you want to know why you and all of us are a little bit full of shit, please enjoy this conversation with Arielle Isaac Norman. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to take a quick moment and thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. GenSpect will be hosting the Bigger Picture Conference in Lisbon, Portugal this September. To learn more about who will be speaking at the conference and to order your tickets, visit genspect.org.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now here's the conversation. Hey Stella, and welcome Ariel.
Howdy.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you. We often go into quite heavy content in our show, so it's a joy to have somebody who might be funny and light.
Yeah, no pressure. You have to be hilarious the whole time.
I was going to say it might be funny because sometimes when I talk about gender, things can get a little serious, but we'll try to also be funny about it.
Well, your comedy special is actually super hilarious, and something that was really great at the very beginning, the guy who's introducing you starts off with she has, and then he corrects himself and goes they have done this and they have done that, and you start off talking about how pronoun-y you look. So for everybody on YouTube, they can verify that you look pretty pronoun-y, which of course is a devastating turn of events in society that you look pronoun-y. But tell us about that. What does it mean to look pronoun-y, and how does that affect your life?
Yeah, I think that people started volunteering pronouns for me it's hard to remember how long ago it was now, whether that was kind of 2016, 17, I would say. That's probably about when. I live in Austin and I have since 2015. And people started tripping over themselves, and people I'd known for years would start asking me my pronouns all the time. And sometimes, because it's particularly as a comedian, when hosts are going to introduce me a lot and they need to know how to talk about me. And so, people would sometimes ask me what my pronouns are. And I'm like, you know what? Why don't we you've known me for years and you still don't know how to pronounce my first name. So let's cover that.
Very good.
And that was before, because I was going just by Arielle Norman in those earlier years. I've gone by Arielle Isaac Norman as my performer name since maybe 2019. Hard for me to remember exactly now, but 2018, I think, because that's when I got divorced for the second time and legally changed my middle name to Isaac. And I think that's when I started going by that. But even before that, people were still asking pronouns a lot. And I knew people were trying to be sweet. They were trying to be right side of history. So I wouldn't get upset. But at the time, when I was first being asked these, I've been doing a podcast, or I had been doing a podcast called Gender Fluids for many years. I think that
Gender fluids? Sorry, with an S? Okay, yes. Just making sure.
Well, it's good that you asked, because sometimes when people would say that before bringing me up to stage, they'd be like, does the Gender Fluid podcast? And I'm like, no. That's the lamest possible thing. But it's because it was a podcast all about sex and gender and kinks and fetishes. And it was me and another trans chick comedian. And we were like very irreverently discussing all of those things. And so it was a fun little play on fluids. But so when people would get that wrong, I'm like, okay, don't make me sound like that. And now I have a podcast called Politically Non-Binary. And I went over it with this host the other day, and she still introduced me as having the non-binary podcast. I'm like, that's not.
No.
And it's no good to have to correct the host as soon as you walk on stage, but you also don't want people thinking that you have a podcast just called the non-binary podcast or the gender fluid podcast. Or at least I don't want people thinking that. But because I also did that podcast, and in that time, we did that podcast for at least 5 or 6 years and maybe 7. And so I was really exploring my gender conception of myself for many years. Austin was definitely a place where a lot of people were exploring their gender. In 2018, I dated a trans dude for a while, and so he wanted us to be gay boys together. And so I've kind of, had fun exploring my gender, and so for a minute, when people would ask me, if someone asked me what my pronouns were, I would say, my preference when you introduce me on stage would actually be for you not to use pronouns at all. There's also studies that show that, at least used to, I don't know if this would replicate now, but there are studies that show that people lose interest quicker if they think a woman's about to come out on stage, or that they might go for their smoke break then. And so there's that. But I was like, well, I'm going to address my gender. So I would prefer you not to set them up with something. And I would try that. And I would say, if you're serious about it, you could just say, this next comic is so funny. Give it up for Arielle Isaac Norman, or give it up for Arielle Norman at the time, or whatever. Yeah. But no one ever succeeded at that. I've had 3 people in the history of my 10.5 years doing comedy who just did it without me even asking, or who succeeded with me asking. But otherwise, what would happen almost invariably is that they would say, this next comic, give it up for, or something like that. Or they would just do they, them. Sometimes they would do 7 theys and thems, which I was like, that's not what no pronouns is.
You know what? You should get more ROGD parents to MC shows because they have become pronoun ninjas and they're very good at not using pronouns. Yeah. So maybe you need to rethink the way the comedy scene is structured.
Yeah, we don't have enough parents in there anyway. So let's. But
I like that as an answer. Their time. When, people sometimes say, oh, I've been asked to put my pronouns in work and stuff. And you could say, I reject pronouns. Do not use pronouns around me.
Well, I did that as a joke in 2015, I think in 2015, yes, because I had moved to Austin and I did this show that was kind of a funny. You were supposed to do anything besides regular stand-up on that show, and so I was doing this character Ariel with no E at the end. So my name is spelled Arielle.
Completely different.
But I did. Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of because Ariel is historically a male name, but the Little Mermaid, changed that for people. And then my parents did this French feminization with the ELLE. And so I had this funny little character, Ariell, and I dressed very queer. I did my hair, my hair was parted down the middle and I was wearing stupid earring, just kind of like a dumb look. And then I told the host, to go ahead and introduce me as like a poet or something that this is my first time doing stand up. And so I came out and I said, because that host, Rob, had used she, her. And I said, well, Rob didn't know, but he also didn't ask, but I actually prefer no pronouns. And that was a joke. In 2015, that was part of this character where my therapist had told me that I needed more of a sense of humor. So I was trying out stand-up comedy but every joke I've ever made about gender has come true within 2 or 3 years. And that's just one. And then I realized, I actually prefer no pronouns if we're being honest. Because for one, I like to be very politically androgynous. And so if I have pronouns at all, if I think of myself as having pronouns or present myself that way, that's already a political statement. And I don't feel like a she, her. That's not how it works. But if we're going to use biology, and I haven't transitioned in any kind of hormonal way, so I've cut my hair and I dress a certain way and I date women and all kinds of things that would be put into the dude category, and I feel very dude-like in a lot of ways, but I haven't transitioned. So for most intents and purposes, I'm a she, her, and I don't want you to get that twisted. Please don't ask me. You can ask me to help you move, but I can't be the only one helping you move. You can. I'm not trying to compete with men in a bunch of different arenas. I don't want to pick up the check for everything. Anyway, so it's important to me that we not get it. Like, I'm female, but I don't, if you're the type of person who uses pronouns to demonstrate some kind of gender vibe, then it wouldn't make sense to call me a she, her. But I'm certainly not going to be a he, him in a lot of situations, but they, them is something I don't even necessarily love as a concept. I mean, we could get into that. But the truth too is that in the gay world, we've always been pretty loosey-goosey with pronouns, and it depends on the situation. And sometimes if a short-haired lesbian walks into a bar, it's like one of the little boy ones, as I used to call them, a masked person walks in, then we might call them he. Or if we're talking about, a couple, we might say he and she for fun, just the same way gay men would call each other ladies. And if we're speaking loosely and poetically, sure, all pronouns, but you wouldn't. Yeah. It would be weird if you just called me he to some stranger or in some context, and I don't. None of them really feel dysphoric to me. But they them feels politically dysphoric to me because that implies that I asked for that.
Mm-hmm. People often miss the point that you just raised there. That actually, like you say, a lot of gay and lesbian people were very loosey-goosey with their pronouns. They were playful and they used them decades ago. And now we have become very intense because it's a political statement. But actually, there's a long history of playing around with pronouns that now feels, I don't know, very incendiary almost for some people.
Well, and I think a lot of the younger people just don't know because I think there's a lot of and by younger people, I mean probably anybody who was born after 1995. I'm going to pick kind of an arbitrary date there, but that a lot of them don't have a lot of older gay friends, and not just because some of them would have died of AIDS or something, but because they're all kind of hanging out with each other on Tumblr and TikTok, and some of them have so much social anxiety, they're not going out into the world and making friends with older people, and so they lose a lot of context about what the world was like. And I remember that in 2012, I had gone to a Dyke March in Boston, and I had gone by myself just to check out women and stuff. And then this organization, like these people found me and they were like, hey, do you want to march with us? It was this organization called Mass Equality, and they gave me a shirt and I was marching with them. And at the end of that day, I was going home on the subway, and this young woman in the subway asked me if I was she was like, oh, so you're part of Mass Equality? And I didn't want to tell her, like, well, I just kind of took the t-shirt and, whatever, because she was cute. And, I didn't. And so
maybe I am. Are you?
Yeah. I was like, yeah. What's up, honey? And so she was like, well, this thing happened where someone from your organization approached me and my friends and said, hey, ladies, and then, tried to get us to sign up for more information about Mass Equality. And I just
God
wanted to say,
forbid.
right, that's like really, he was just assuming our genders and calling us all ladies, and like, he doesn't know how we all identify. And I just think that needs to be addressed. And I didn't know if you knew who we could contact to really address that. And that's when I was like, you know what? I'm not really a part of this organization. I'm sure you can find an email on their website. But, I'm like, okay, so this person looked to be about 22, something like that. And all of her friends did. And it's like, okay, gay men have always called each other lady. They call everyone. It's fun. Remember, because so many people call everyone guys as the collective. So they're subverting that, and they're going, let's do hey ladies to everybody. And so many of these, lesbians transition to gay men anyway. You think they'd be very affirmed by a gay man, including them by calling them ladies and things like that. But they were upset about this, what turned out to be imaginary offense, because all of them did turn out to identify as women. And
oh God, that makes it even more insufferable.
Truly, I asked. I was like, so are some of y'all, what's going on with that? They're like, no. Yeah. And then it's also like, did you even ask him? Because you're calling him a man. Did you ask him?
Touche.
I didn't follow up. I didn't want to get into it with these people. They seemed very strident. But this was at the same time that since my encounter of a lot of the beginning of this stuff was 2012. I was not really ever a Tumblr person, so I didn't get it from that. But I lived in Boston from 2011 to the end of 2014. And so, and there's all these women's colleges and liberal colleges around there. And so there was a lot of this. And one of my friends which one's the women's college? Is it Wellesley or Wesleyan? Because I can never get that.
I think it's
straight.
Wellesley, but I'm not sure. I'll look it up while we're chatting.
Whichever one that is, she'd gone to that, and we had been friends for a year or two. We talked almost every day, and she had a girlfriend and everything. And when one day I was talking to her and saying something about her, I said something about us being lesbians. She's like, well, I'm not a lesbian. And I was like, but, well, what? And she said, well, I'm not a lesbian because I'm not a woman. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then that's when she wanted to be, considered gender neutral and stuff. And that was my first, and I'm just like, and because it was the thing that people complain about, where you're like, okay, even if that's a thing for you, why would you correct me on it instead of saying, hey, actually, like, I know I've always called myself a lesbian, but I actually have decided, like, I self-conceive in this different way. And so it would be nice if you would, it was that thing of like, why are you mad? I've known you for a year and a half. Don't act like I should have known something that you just decided 5 minutes ago.
In your head, in an invisible manner.
Yeah, obscure.
Yeah.
We'd had lunch the day before and she was a lesbian. So, and I'm still calling her she because I don't know. I think her pronouns have changed a number of times and whatever, but.
Yeah. It is Wellesley, by the way. You're correct.
Well,
so that was around 2012?
Okay.
Okay. And so is that part of like what started getting you thinking about doing a whole special on gender? Like, what was your kind of inspiration for that?
Well, I started comedy in 2014 when I was still in Boston. I moved to Austin in 2015.
Can I ask, what
And
were you doing before? I'm very curious about the process of a comic. So what did you come from?
Yeah.
I
Can't
mean,
imagine.
I got a degree in psychology and was originally planning on going into, academia. And then I realized that
You
I
needed to
didn't
do
want to be.
something worthwhile.
Yeah, I was.
No kidding.
Everyone talks in jargon to each other, no, and then
Yeah.
and you have to be kind of tethered to like one weird thing that I just like. I don't like paperwork, to be honest.
Oh, mhm,
So I was like, I'm a very kind of, I like being a bit of a dilettante. I like, kind of looking into a lot of different things. And so I was trying to figure out, like, can I be a writer? I tried out a lot of different things in my 20s, like maybe some kind of writer. I was doing cartooning for a while, a lot of different creative pursuits. And at one point, at 23, I actually thought I should be a stand-up comedian, and I knew it. And I was about to move to New York anyway, and I was going to do it. But then I ran away from it for years because it was so scary to do something that you really care about.
yeah.
And it's really hard. And things are much better now for newer comics. But at the time in 2010 in New York, the open mic scene was still real dicey in terms of, just you go to an open mic and there's 9 people there, but at any given time, half of them are outside smoking and the ones inside are on their phones, not looking at you when you're up on stage. And yes, it's
And
a
the
lot better
amount
now.
of like preparation and planning and practice that it takes to be a stand-up comic and get on stage, like it just must be devastating to have like no attention, no eyeballs, no engagement.
Yeah. But anyway, that's a whole other
Okay.
story.
All right.
So I, yeah, we don't have long enough for me to get onto too many tangents. So, so I started thinking about the gender stuff more seriously when I moved to Austin. I wasn't, in my early days of stand up, it's like it's easier to tell a lot of sex and lesbian jokes, and that was fun. I used to do a lot of period jokes too, just because there's this idea that like periods aren't funny to people, and I loved getting straight men to just laugh at periods for 20 minutes in a row, and so that was just me kind of like also figuring out how to be on stage comfortably. And so it's only in the last handful of years that I've become more political. And I made friends with the trans woman, Ava Smart, who I would do the Gender Fluids podcast for a long time. We made friends in 2015. And it was so fun because I'd known some trans people a little bit, or kind of seen them at college and had little conversations. Like, I was aware to some extent, but she was the first one that I really knew. And it was so great because she would call a spade a spade. We could talk about reality. And she wasn't like coy about that she had a dick, or that it was like we could just talk freely, and she had a dark sense of humor. And it was so fun to be able to explore gender topics. And in, I think 2016, maybe we started the podcast together, and just realized like we have these fun conversations, like we should put them out there. And we just had the best time. But I knew that there was something weird going on with the gender world because of the 2012 stuff. And I was paying a little bit of attention, but things hadn't ramped up nearly to, where they've been for the last several years. And so it wasn't like a huge pressing thing, but in the same way that I'm a bit of a contrarian, I was raised a gay Mormon in Texas. And so I was always kind of pushing against one thing or the other in some various contexts of my life. And so I knew that I didn't really believe, for instance, that people are just born gay. And that idea, that I knew that was something that was politically expedient that we went with to get rights, but that it's not that simple. Not that we're not born with some genes that are probably going to express as homosexual given most environments where it's an option or something like that, but that it's just not as simple as that we're born gay. And so I've always kind of known that like we might say things that are politically expedient that aren't exactly true. And when we would argue for gay marriage, and conservative people would say there might be a slippery slope effect to this, I knew sometimes that was an exaggerated fear, but I was also like, yeah, it could change things if you change the definition of marriage. It can change. It's not like nothing is going to change. And probably we will be going for some kind of polyamorous stuff one day. Indeed, you can see no one really would have predicted this slippery slope that the gender thing would become the big question. But I knew that we were kind of full of shit a little bit, or not full of shit, but there was some shit in our pile that we were pretending wasn't there. And
was that given? Would most people have agreed with you back then, or are you unusual thinking that? Because these days, that's a very big deal to say that.
And kind of to add to that, I'd be curious if you and Ava were talking about that on the show. Like, were you guys parsing this out with other people or were you the only person having these private thoughts?
Pretty much me. Ava and I didn't have guests very often on the podcast anyway. It was more of us talking. But also, I'm more of the contrarian in those ways. She's definitely open to things, but I wasn't going to try to push people on. That's always been kind of a little fun thing of mine, a little party trick almost of I don't know if we're born gay. And all women are bi anyway to some extent, even if it's only a little bit of this or that for some people. And women are pretty famously fluid and adaptable, and maybe men would be more too if there were, I don't know. But I just think I've always found the world to be grayer and more complicated than people like to pretend and admit to themselves. And so that's just always been kind of fun for me. But that wasn't something that she and I were really focused on. I mean, a lot of the podcast is about sexual fetishes and then, me kind of exploring my gender identity slowly over time and whatnot. So I think that in 2016, when Trump got elected, then there was this real shift where all of the kind of the young liberal people that I knew really felt like we can no longer question ourselves. We can no longer examine anything we might be wrong about. We just have to focus on how wrong and bad the other side is. And I was like, look, there's a reason that I don't think this was just rigged. I certainly, I think there's a reason that Hillary Clinton wasn't popular. I think there's a reason Trump, was getting likes, and I think maybe we should examine kind of what we're missing, what we're getting wrong over here on the blue team side of things. And Ava, I'll never forget, she literally said, no, we have to circle the wagons. That's the phrase that she used. We have to circle the wagons. And that's exactly what happened. They became increasingly insular. Let's not listen to outside voices. We're not taking criticism. Basically, that was for the moment Trump got elected, we're not taking questions. You can imagine the PR person up there going, no questions. We're not going to be having that. And in fact, if you ask us questions, we will say that you're racist, transphobic, problematic, etc. And so, and by 2017, I remember one time when we were recording the podcast, 2017 or 2018, I tried to say something about a biological sex. I tried to say something about how, well, Ava, you and I are still different because, you were born biologically male. And she stopped me and said, no, you can't say that. And at the time it was because it was mean. It was not nice to point out biological differences. And I'm like, yeah, but we're talking about an area where they matter. And then within a year of that, I started seeing more and more people online and more, a lot of these people have philosophy degrees or something. Yes. And so they were starting to really argue, no, trans women are biologically female.
Yeah.
Some of them would say we're kind of intersexed in some way that science hasn't figured out yet. But they were arguing we are biologically female. And once you start making it so that I can't discuss reality, I'm out. And so I knew in my head, for since sometime around that time, I'd already been writing jokes privately about how there's a slippery slope. Of course there is. Even probably in 2015, 2016, I would write jokes that I maybe never even told. I don't remember, but about how, yeah, there's a slippery slope. One day your kid's gonna want to marry a robot that in a polyamorous situation where the robot identifies as something, but
Mm.
I was kind of like, not taking it. But when the queer world and the young people started living in a completely disengaged from reality, then I was like, all right, I'm a double agent a little bit at this point because and not that that's exactly how I think of myself because I'm very much not working for the quote unquote other side, but that I'm like, there's some things that they're getting wrong here. And I don't think I can just publicly right now go ahead and start fighting against this, but I'm going to have to write some jokes to help these people get out of this. And so the jokes that are in the special that I put out a few months ago, some of them I probably started telling in like 2017. So they were all written anywhere from 2017 to 2023. And and increasingly, over the last couple of years from that, like, because for a long time, not everybody would know what I was talking about. And there was too much that I would have to explain.
I was actually going to say, because like what I thought when I saw your special was like kind of two main things. First of all, your punchlines are very, very surprising, as is the case for all good punchlines, right? But they also indicate that you know a lot about what's going on, right? So some of the more like popular mainstream comics who have talked about gender and gotten a lot of like notoriety for doing so, their jokes are of course very funny, but you can tell they have a very superficial understanding of what the hell's even going on. But like the way you have delivered, like you have an amazing puberty blockers joke that is like mind blowing, and you're non-binary.
You should see my new ones.
Oh, I can't wait! Like your non-binary breast jokes like had me shocked and in stitches, and I was like, oh my god, duh. So there's something about your material that really like it's very obvious that you know what is going on in the inner workings of this gender stuff way more than like, no offense Dave Chappelle, but like people like that who are making these jokes. So sorry, so keep going.
Yeah, no, and that's something that I really like to use because who that's going to be critical of some of the craziness in the gender world knows as much as I do. Most people who are critical of it, you're right, have a much more shallow understanding. But having done that podcast for years, having lived in Austin since 2015, having been an out gay person since I was 17 years old, 16, I guess. I know, like I dated a trans dude for a while. Like I've kickboxed with a trans woman before. Like, I don't know. I've lived with trans women for years of various whatever. And so I do think I'm in a special position. And I really wanted people who could be swayed to thinking about things in a broader way to be able to hear it from someone. And so I never wanted to really come out too much and just be like, hey, here's what I really think. And let's, talk about that. I wanted to kind of say like, guys, I love them all. And even the trans women, the people who identify as trans women who I don't think feel like women to me in any way, but I think are autistic perverts. I'm like, I'm a little bit of an autistic pervert. There's nothing wrong with being an autistic pervert, but I think you're confused and I don't think you're really a woman in a lot of meaningful ways. And so that changes whether I want you at my lesbian orgies, and, and so I felt like last year, the reason I put the special out finally was because it felt like, okay, we're at a cross section where some of these jokes are starting to feel old to me. I'm moving on with material that's, further than that. But I think enough people know what I'm talking about. I think enough people can I don't have to do too much explaining in my joke. I think people who are at least kind of aware of anything will be able to understand now what I'm saying and why it's relevant. But I already feel like so many of those, it's delightful to me that that you like them so much because in my mind I'm like, they're so old. That stuff's all we're moving on as a culture, and so I was trying to find just the right moment where people would get it.
It's funny you say that. I had breakfast with some friends of my husband the other day, along with him, and the guy had no idea what puberty blockers were. And so it's just like really strange. Like in your audiences, you may not be able to gauge this from the stage, but probably to some degree you can. Like, it's like there are people who know about this world and get totally immersed. And then there are people who literally have no idea about anything.
Yeah.
Yes. And because I do a whole puberty blockers chunk right now in my stand-up, I do ask audiences oftentimes, clap if you know what puberty blockers are. Okay. And it's about 50% on average of people who, and sometimes they're kind of like, yeah. And sometimes they're like, yeah. You know, there's various reactions.
Are there people like, woohoo, puberty blockers?
Not so much of that vibe, because that's a weird one to really be cheering for.
I have a story about that. I'll tell it after. Keep going.
Oh, dear. It's there are definitely people who, with any gender stuff, try to do that liberal kind of clapter thing of like, yeah, you know? But for the most part with puberty blockers, I think people are a little tamer. But I will say a lot. I think that right now and for the last couple of months, more conservative people actually are more aware of puberty blockers than a lot of liberal people.
Yeah.
A lot of liberal people aren't paying that much attention. You know, we all know there's just a lot of good-hearted liberal people who just want to be on the right side of history, and they wrote a blank check to trans people a long time ago, and they're not really following up on what's being done with their money, if you have this analogy. And they just are like, hey, because, you know, people do this copy paste stuff about how puberty blockers are reversible. There's no harm, no foul. It's the science says yes, follow the science. And that's all they needed. And so, you know, if they don't know anybody in this, if they didn't watch Jazz Jennings not have a big enough dick to make a good penis or vagina later, you know, then they just don't know. Whereas conservative people have started talking about these things. And I've told the trans community in every way I could for all these years, like, guys, if you guys don't take our questions, if you guys don't compromise, if you don't think about the criticisms that are happening seriously, they'll backlash. Once conservative people find out about stuff, especially when it comes to children, prisons, and sports, the backlash for that is you're not going to like it. And in some ways they do like it, some of them, because they want to be the most oppressed people in the world. And so there's that aspect of it where maybe that's what they actually did want. But for many people who are just, you know, living with their gender dysphoria and they've transitioned and they just want to live their lives as the opposite sexual presentation, they really don't want this backlash. And so it's just heartbreaking because there are a lot of trans people who really are not the kind of people that criticize in this way, but the real activist-y types have really ruined it because now that conservative people, they still don't know. I always say, like, conservative people don't even have to exaggerate about what's going on in order to kind of fear. It's not fear mongering. They're really, they still only kind of know half of the iceberg. And so I'm like, there's still some time to get the queer world, the young world to have a better vision of this before they figure out everything that's been going on in this world. So, I mean, there's still most queer people don't even know a lot of what's going on in the AGP world.
Yeah. We hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are. We just wanted to take a quick moment and say thank you to all of our listeners. Your support helps us to keep the lights on and the mics hot.
We recently made the switch to Substack so we could build a more robust listener community. Visit widerlenspod.com and check out the different subscription tiers.
For those of you who are in need of parenting support and resources, we each have parent coaching membership groups. Plus, you can buy our book, When Kids Say They're Trans.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe and get involved in the lively discourse in the comments section.
Thank you so much. Now, back to the show. Yeah, that's really interesting because I in my mind, I kind of think about it as like a horseshoe. Like, let's say it's a horseshoe in political spectrum. So this is just broadly. So the most conservative people know a lot about the youth gender dysphoria issue. Then you go around like the less kind of more moderate, probably don't know much. And then the liberals don't really know much. But then the most liberal people are like, yeah, puberty blockers are reversible and safe. So it's interesting. Like the two people at the ends of the political extremes seem to be really, invested in this issue. But of course, I probably am somewhere in the middle of the moderate range now, but I think we are still like on the fringes. I think the most average person probably not bought into this or like aware of this yet, though I think it's getting there.
Yeah. And that's part of why I like talking about these things on stage myself, because as someone who is very moderate-minded, hearted person, but very knowledgeable about this stuff. I'd rather people get their first or early dose of this from me, because they're not going to hear the propaganda from one side, the fear-mongering propaganda from the other. I want them to get this thing where I'm going to tell the truth as far as I can in a funny way. It's like, I just love, there are people who I'll talk about puberty blockers really explicitly and make these jokes about them. And then they come up and tell me this is the first stand-up comedy show they've ever been to. I'm like, wow, this is not what it's always going to be like. But here's your education.
Interesting.
Do you get shamed or silenced or guilted about your material much?
When I'm doing live shows, I try to gauge the audience and meet them where they're at. If it's too conservative of an audience, I don't want to just talk to them completely about this stuff the way I would to a liberal audience, because I don't want to just cement their, antagonism. But they like hearing about it, and I still can talk about it in a way where I'm adding a little compassion to the mix while agreeing with them about their fears. And then when I'm talking to a liberal audience, I like to kind of, show them where they're wrong. But if it's a pride show or if it's a very queer audience, I'm not going to go as hard into it. I'm going to still try to rib them a little bit, but I try not, because I don't want to just, if the front row all have really weird haircuts and strange tiny little beards or whatever, I'm not gonna sit there and explain why they've made a lot of bad decisions, or something like that, or or whatever.
Look at the state of the front row.
Yeah. Sometimes it's fun, because sometimes there will be trans people in the audience who love it, and totally agree with everything I'm talking about. So I try to gauge it. I see how they laugh at some of the early jokes. And then we go, how far can we take this? But in online, I've had a fair amount of pushback from people. Someone called me far right the other day. I would love to know what my far right positions are. And I get it from both sides, of course, online. I'm called a liberal idiot and far right and whatever, all the time. But I got, the first time I really had a problem was that years ago, I must have been right after Elliot Page got top surgery. I riffed something at a show where I said that I was like, yeah, it kind of sucks. I was hoping that he was going to choose to just keep the boobs. I was hoping it was going to be one of those things, because you could do anything you want. So like he could be he or he they, I think, and then keep the boobs. It's like, I can't imagine that they're that big anyway, whatever. And I was kind of riffing that, and I said something about how I was like, yeah, it just kind of bothers me that all these lesbians or artists formerly known as lesbians are all chopping their boobs off right now, because at the time I was polyamorous. I'm not right now. But I was like, because I'm poly and I was going to fuck all these chicks, but now I don't really care. And so that's like a joke. And if you're at the show and you've already gotten to know me for 15 minutes and kind of the hint of persona that I have, because if I have any persona on stage, it's a little bit of a fuckboy, I guess, or it was at the time when I was poly. And
your girlfriend's listening, and she's like, "Not anymore."
yeah, I know. I mean, very. I'm not open, and so. But, I posted that joke, and there's not enough, you have to post these 60-second long things on Instagram, and there wasn't enough context. And if you're not at the show and you haven't already agreed to be at a comedy show and kind of gotten to know me, and I didn't realize this was early for me in trying to post content to Instagram. And so I didn't understand all of that. I didn't really think that through. I just thought this was such a fun in the moment thing that I wanted to share. And because I have some fans in the Austin queer world, then some of them saw it and it went to a lot of queer Austinites, and I was getting a lot of hate and people telling me they were kicking me out of the queer community, and just, how could I, and how dare I talk about anybody else's transition and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I don't know. I think you're allowed to talk about famous people, whatever. Yeah. But that's just how it works. But and it was really interesting, because that was my first moment of kind of like, it was like a little mini cancellation, but as opposed to most people who face that, like this, you could face some kind of pile on online, but this was the Austin queer community that was who had found it. And so since then, I've always felt a little bit of discomfort going to any kind of queer event in Austin, and I often avoid them. It's only gotten more intense over the years because some of Ava's friends decided over time that they didn't like me, and people started calling me a TERF increasingly. It's certainly not how I identify, and I'd like you to make your case, but so that's been, I get pushback, but it's mostly, I think I did a really good job making it very hard to just dismiss me out of hand. But there are people who, they can still just call me a TERF, and that's all they need. And if you do that, then, there's other people will just believe them. So I've faced backlash largely in the Austin world.
Well, that's depressing.
It is, especially because it seems like you face a lot of backlash in the comedy world and whatever the queer segment of it is, as you described it. And I just think, comedy always points out really awkward, uncomfortable, sometimes like embarrassing things about the world. And whether you agree with the comic's perspective or not is almost like not the point. That's what comics are supposed to do, is like point out these absurdities about the world. And it's really unfortunate that even in the comedy scene that is harder to do. Is there a generational difference between like who's trying to quote shun you versus people who are comics for decades and they're like, no, we know that this is how comedy works? Or
absolutely. It's very clear in the queer world that kind of anybody my age or younger, I'm 37, I was born in 86, right? So anybody my age or younger is more likely to be kind of on the woke side of things. And anyone my age or older is a little more likely to be on the kind of old school gay side of things. And old school gay people, I'm sure you guys know, are very funny and are very irreverent. And drag queens always made the craziest jokes, and we would roast each other and read each other, and it was all very un-PC. We were the least politically correct people ever, especially when we got together. And I think the young people really just don't have experience of that, and they don't really know. And it started becoming fun and advantageous to them to police each other. And so that's how they have fun, as opposed to us making jokes and trying to not take things so seriously. And I think probably because the older generations also, actually did suffer a lot from being gay and gender nonconforming. And so we didn't have to create this whole thing. Like we suffered and we wanted to laugh. We had been shamed and guilted. We were all raised religiously. We were all kicked out of various things and shunned from various things. We all actually fought for our rights and were worried about whether we would ever have them. And so we needed that release of tension. And it's almost like the younger people don't have enough tension and need to create the tension. But I look forward to the day when they could release that tension, because it's a lot of tension.
Yeah, it's funny. It does feel like they're trying to create this kind of virtuous struggle, because maybe it's also a kind of a human need, but it's maybe also written into the kind of history of what it means to be like a queer person. And of course, activists of any genre use the struggle as a really important moment in the narrative, right? So it's kind of like this weird self-fulfilling cycle thing that if you don't have actual struggle, you'll find a way to invent it or something.
I like to joke that we should go back to the 90s when being gay was wrong, that maybe that was the sweet spot, because it was hot, right? Remember when gay sex was super hot? It was so taboo and wrong.
Yes.
Well, I was Mormon, we Mormons have it at least as bad as Catholics. And
it adds a bit of spice, though.
Yeah. I think they have different spices, but also, I don't know it's like some people ask if they can share curse words on podcasts. I'm like,
yeah,
I don't know if y'all want to hear. But no, it's not that. Like, I have a really fucked up joke. You guys okay with a really fucked up joke?
Okay, yeah, everyone whose small children are now listening, please take them away. Go for it.
Children,
you gotta hear it.
Pearl clutchers. Well, it's just this idea of like, maybe it was better when being gay was taboo because, businessmen and the elites, the politicians, when they wanted to blackmail each other, they all had these systems, right? They're going to Bohemian Grove and they're all getting each other to do gay stuff and then filming that and taking pictures. And then they would use that. You would get power, but they would hold that over your head. But now, because being gay is not taboo or really, frowned upon anymore, in order to blackmail each other, they have to get each other to fuck kids. So maybe we should have stayed. Maybe. I told you, I was like, you're probably gonna have to edit that out, but
Dude, that's so interesting.
I don't know if it's completely untrue.
Well, it's like when society has certain kind of like behaviors that are illegal or shunned, those kind of stay contained, I guess. But like if everything is okay, we push the needle to like more, whether or not there's historical accuracy to your joke, but it is a very interesting thing to think about. I'm sure there have been horrible child abusers forever. But it's like now that is one of the few things that is taboo. And you even see, like, not to bring it back to the W path, but like the kinds of things that they're advocating for being okay in there are so shocking that I do think society has just like moved the needle. If nothing is going to be morally repugnant, then we just have to push it to the furthest extreme.
Oh my God.
Exactly. And that's exactly my point with that joke. Even if it's not completely historically true, we've done this thing to our sense of boundaries where we go, okay, we actually don't know. We don't have any agreement on where they are. And so, the kind of liberal, ideas are going to lead us to the idea of basically anything goes, as long as you don't see completely direct harm. If you don't see the harm that is exactly in that moment happening, they're not thinking about kind of long-term unintended consequences. That's, or how it might affect the larger society if you change certain things about yourself. It's like only direct harm is being seen. And so, I think that's a slippery slope when and so again, like I don't want people to actually discriminate against homosexuals. I'm fine with it if you don't want to bake me a cake. I don't know why I would want to give my business to someone who doesn't want to bake me a cake in the first place. I'd rather support somebody else's business. And I think that people should have religious freedom to, not believe in gay marriage. I believe in individual rights and freedom that way. So I've always been on that. And that's another one of those sticking points where the gays increasingly, the queer world increasingly was like, that's wrong. They have to bake us cakes. And I'm like, but what? Why? Shouldn't it be? Don't you want them to have free or like these ministers have to marry gay people if they don't believe in it? Why would you want a minister who doesn't believe in your marriage to be marrying you?
Or even like a cake that might have something against their religion written on the cake. Why would you?
That's horrible.
Yeah.
You're not going to win anyone to your cause. They wanted to force, religious organizations to help gay people adopt kids even. And even that, I'm like, no, you need to go to a different agency. That's so weird. And I don't think it's going to lead to a good outcome for anybody.
Yeah, I think that kind of like dogmatic forcing really erodes the relationships that can exist between people. Because like if I am a person who goes to a baker and demands that they bake my cake despite them having some real qualms with my lifestyle or whatever, I will always be suspicious that I'm not getting people's genuine response to me. Like I will never really trust if someone's being nice to me, if they actually like me or if they're afraid. Like that erodes trust. And it's really, I don't see how that's beneficial. And I don't know why people don't realize that. It's like not good for relationships.
I don't like forcing people to do stuff. I want to win their hearts and minds. I don't want to force them. I think that just makes people resent you. And that's the fight I would get into with Ava and her friends a fair amount. Was they said no, we want to force people. If we don't force them, they won't do it. I'm like, no, gay people. The reason that we have gay marriage is because we all came out. It was really hard, but we all came out to people, and then they knew their friend, their daughter, their cousin. They knew someone who was gay, and they realized that we have a lot of the same values. They love us. And that's how we did it. We went hearts and minds. We didn't say, you have to do this or else you're bigots and we're gonna get stack the Supreme Court to get our way. we were like, this is a long-term project and we want to make sure it lasts. I mean, and you could see what happened to, abortion rights. And we didn't want that. And, we're still kind of afraid because it was the Supreme Court with gay marriage. But you can also see that the acceptance for gay marriage and for gay people, the polls are still good and on our side. They might be slipping, but they're still, we got it to the place where a strong majority of the country was like, of course, gay marriage. Yes.
Yeah.
Could I ask you a question? Just something you mentioned earlier that I'm interested in, because I'm older than you, I don't know much about it. The polyamory scene. I always think it's probably seething with all sorts of neuroses. So go on, spill.
I'm going to say this. The queer world is seething with neuroses. The young world is seething with neuroses. America is seething with neuroses.
The straight world is seething with neuroses.
They're not. Most of everybody's relationships fail. Okay. Or end at some point. A lot of people don't want us to talk about failure, but most relationships do end, and not always in a fun way. So it's not like I hesitate to be completely critical of the polyamory world, because I think, it's also society is still so used to monogamy that it's not set up for poly situations to thrive. And, people need to figure out boundaries and communication. And it's a high level thing to be doing that in a monogamous world, where you're not trained for that at all. I think that it doesn't seem still clear to me that monogamy is the only healthiest way and that everyone needs to do that, especially, we don't need to be doing this Noah's Ark 2x2. You have your kids in a nuclear family situation. Not everyone wants to have kids. I think one thing about the old form of polygamy, right, was that one man would have several wives, or more commonly for a while, for hundreds of years now, a man would have a wife and then cheat on her a lot. But if you have it where, let's say, two women who are best friends, maybe they like each other sexually, maybe not, but they're best friends and they want to be partners in some way. If they chose a man together and thought of it as, this is our good boy, who's going to move the furniture, and maybe he has enough testosterone to be motivated to make more money and whatever, and we'll enjoy sex with him and to make babies with him. I think we could think about things in a shifted way where we could realize, it might make some sense for some different patterns to play out when it comes to these relationship structures. And it could be really good for people. As much as, I don't like the luxury, it's called a luxury belief, like you don't need a 2-parent household. And I'm like, no, I would never suggest a 1-parent household, but potentially having 3 or 4 or 5, I think it would have really helped my mom if she had some sister wives. She didn't have enough maternal energy, we'll put it that way, for 5 kids. And so I think it would have really benefited me to have an actual mommy somewhere in there. And so it's, I think so I don't want to give polyamory too bad of a rap. But I think I was, in my journey, also using it to make friends in a way. And I think I was also thinking of my own value to people too much tied to their attraction to me. And I think I'm learning that it really got in the way, actually, of making friendships. And so I kind of am of the mind that unless you are trying for an untraditional structure, which I did a polyamorous commune thing for a minute, but that's a whole other story. And it didn't end well. But if you're not going for that, then I think, couples could probably be best to just officially just be monogamous. But if you're in your place and you trust each other and you love each other and you have good communication, and you sometimes go to kink parties, or you sometimes do hook up, you have a threesome or something, you don't maybe need to call yourself polyamorous. You could just hot people sometimes hook up with their friends and don't talk about, is that
I was
kind of
just
old
going to
Hollywood?
say, this is what's so interesting. I think the behavior of polyamorous groupings isn't really necessarily that different from what young people who are out and about in the dating world have been doing, but there's just like this now, there's a label on it. There's a whole like philosophy trying to, I'm not saying you're doing this, but I see that there are people who kind of advocate for polyamory as some sort of enlightened way of being in the world and trying to really say like, no, this is good. This is healthy. Whereas really, like, I think like any configuration of relationships, people can use those situations, like you said, to kind of escape something that they don't want to deal with, or to validate themselves. Or, you know, at least with young people I work with, it's like, if I'm feeling a little neglected by my partner, rather than processing those emotions, I'm going to go sleep with some other person that I'm in a polycule with or something. So it's like,
right. Or like, maybe I am too afraid to talk to my primary partner about some sexual fantasy that I have, or some things I think that it might disturb their image of my gender for them. And so I can just go do that with someone else, but maybe it would have enriched your primary relationship if you went through the vulnerability of talking about something like that. And yeah, absolutely. And also there are, especially men, who will use the poly thing, the non-monogamy thing, as a way to just be a fuckboy while still being with their, and kind of eat their cake and have it too. And, you know, calling yourself ethically non-monogamous, or E&M as it's abbreviated on the dating apps, is a matter of self-ID. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's like, just because you say it, I think it's weird anyway that we put that, like, E&M, I'm ethically non-monogamous. It's like, well, if you're going to say you're non-monogamous, right, we're going to assume you're not just going to say, I'm a bad person and I'm non-monogamous.
Yeah, totally.
I'm going to assume you think you're trying to be ethical. It's very protesting too much to me to be like,
it's like Dexter when he was like an ethical murderer.
Right, well, but he actually, wasn't he? He did a pretty good job.
Yeah, he was. Before we let you go, we definitely want to talk about what this whole gender evolution has done in the world of lesbians and in your experience. But we want to ask, is there any book, podcast, movie, TV show, anything interesting that you're reading or watching right now that you can recommend to our audience?
I have been reading a book called The True Believer. And I think it actually came out a few decades ago, but it's very prescient and very much speaks to our time of how mass movements happen and what kind of precedes them and what leads to them, and that psychology. So, I mean, the problem with that question for me is that I listen to so many podcasts, I read so many books at a time. And I'm kind of like always a frenzy of stuff, especially my girlfriend's out of town right now. So I'm just constantly catching up on all my podcasts. But I think that book is one that I think would help some people see a little bit clearer what's happened to the young people in a way that's not kind of, especially in a way it's the divorce from the current political woke, anti-woke conversation.
Yeah.
It's precedes that. And so it's a little bit more, neutral to be able to read it that way.
Is it a heavy book or a light read? It sounds good.
It's actually not. He speaks very clearly and directly, and he'll have short sections a lot of the times. I listen to it as an audiobook, and now I'm reading it as a physical book because I'm going to do a book club about it. It's very, I'm an intelligent person, but still, it's a pretty easy book to read. It's he's like I said, he's very clear and articulate, and you probably have to be fairly intelligent to read it, but it's not like dense. I don't like reading academic kind of stuff.
So all of our chimpanzee listeners will have to sit this one out, but for the humans who can read,
I think I'm out, but you could read it, Sasha.
No, you'd like it. It's good.
I did a video actually about how trans is a kind of religious conversion. So it's very interesting. And I, of course, don't talk about woke versus non-woke, but I think that sounds like a fascinating book. Yeah. You talked about some new material. Is there anywhere people can see that yet? Or do they have to come to Austin to one of your shows?
Well, where I do travel, I go on tour sometimes. So if you you can go to arielleisacnorman.com, or also just Ariel Norman. They both work. Or you could follow me on Instagram at @LIntoGenderless and find stuff. You can sign up for a newsletter on any of these things. Okay. Or just DM me on Instagram and I'll make you give me your phone number so I can text you when I come to your city. Because seeing me live is the best way to see the new material, because I don't.
Okay. Me too. Yeah. If you ever come out to Arizona or Ireland, just let us know.
I will. Where are you in Arizona? Well, we can
in Phoenix. Yeah, I'm in Phoenix.
I was actually in Phoenix last November. I didn't realize that's where you were.
Yeah, next time you come out. Time. All right, Ariel. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank
you. Really
you.
Interesting.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.